Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Minds Worth Meeting. We have a special treat today. Our guest is Columbia Business School professor and author of The Art of Choosing and the very new book, Think Bigger, How to Innovate, Professor Sheena Iyengar. Sheena, welcome to Minds Worth Meeting.
Thank you for having me.
So we've got a lot to unpack with these two books. Let's start with telling our audience who you are, where you're from, and what you do.
Wow, who am I? That's a big question. So, I am a professor at the Columbia Business School. I teach a course called Think Bigger, which is the title of my latest book. And I have been at the Columbia Business School since 1998. And what else would you like to know about me?
And where are you from?
Oh, well, I guess I'm of Indian heritage. I was born in Toronto, I like to say by accident. But I grew up really in New York. My parents arrived here when I was 2, so I don't really remember Toronto. So I grew up in Queens, and then I grew up in New Jersey. And so in 1998, after finishing all my undergrad and my graduate and a little stint at MIT, I came back to New York, and this is where I live.
Wonderful. Well, it's always nice to have another Jersey girl in the virtual house.
Exactly, yes. So from 10 until 17, I lived in Elmwood Park in Bergen County, New Jersey.
Wonderful, wonderful. So your TED Talk, which has over 4 million views just on the TED website alone and millions elsewhere, it's a testament to the intrigue and the importance of your work. So what led you, the TED Talk was on The Art of Choosing, your first book that we'll be discussing today. What led you to question and study choice?
So I guess two things about me. My personal experiences that probably got me very interested in choice is that first off, I am blind, and I was born with a rare form of retinitis pigmentosa, so I went blind at a very young age. And I'm also Indian American, that grew up in a very traditional household, but went to normal schools in the U.S. So I think growing up, I did struggle a lot with the narrative around choice, right? Because the American dream was that you could do and be whatever it is you wanted to be. But here I was, this girl growing up blind, and the most common conversation that I was confronting is, what choices did I have? And so everywhere I went, there were always questions about what would I be able to do? Could I read? Could I learn to write? Could I do math? Could I go to normal school? How was I going to get around? Was I going to have friends? I mean, the questions seemed endless. And so they all boiled down to, what choices would I have? And so for me, at a very early age, I'm starting to think about, well, what choices could I have? And maybe people were wrong, and maybe I did have more choices than they thought possible, or maybe there were some choices I could create. So I think that was certainly something that informed my interest and study of choice. And the other thing that informed my interest in study of choice was the fact that I was growing up in a sense with two cultures and two entirely different narratives about choice. As a Sikh American, and as a Sikh person, I was growing up with the idea that, the ability to choose wasn't something that you thought was positive or glorious. It actually came with it a lot of responsibility. And that first and foremost, that you as a Sikh person had to think about your duties and responsibilities, that you didn't just run to choice. That was considered almost naive. Right. And yet, as an American in school, I was, told, this is my birthright. The pinnacle of life was me getting to choose who I was and what was I going to be. And so it seemed like there were two entirely different perspectives on how you were supposed to make the big decisions that would end up shaping your life. I mean, in Indian culture, they believed in arranged marriage. In American culture, they believed in love marriage. In Indian culture, your career was sort of chosen for you by your parents or people that knew better. And in American culture, you got to make such decisions. So I think it was the opposing narratives plus me being blind and being juxtaposed against a culture that really glorified choice that I began to ask maybe questions that other people had not asked before in science about, well, what exactly is choice? How much of the desire for choice is innate? How much of it is biological versus cultural? What does choice actually give you as a tool? How do you get the most from this thing called choice?
What would you say are kind of the conclusions that you've come to? Is it cultural? Is it biological choice?
I think we all share an innate desire to exercise some amount of agency over our immediate environment, right? There's no human being, no matter where on the planet, in fact, there's no animal, no matter where on the planet, that would welcome the opportunity to be locked up behind bars. Right? We don't like that.
Right.
And we all react negatively when a choice that we've gotten used to is taken away from us. So those are things that are clearly shared. Everything else about choice, like how many choices you should have, what constitutes a good and bad choice, how choices should be made, who's in the position to make a choice. This is all cultural. I mean, these are things you're taught from very early on, both implicitly and explicitly as you're growing up by school, by your parents, by the news, by your political leaders, etc.
Right. So your new book, Think Bigger, is already receiving positive reviews, as we saw in the Financial Times this morning. You've said that Think Bigger is a continuation of the art of choosing. So what role does choice play in innovation and creative thinking?
Huge. I think until now, we have always assumed almost implicitly that choice belongs in one bucket and innovation is a totally different bucket. And that's because there were scientists from totally different disciplines that studied those two things, and so they never came together. But in fact, every innovation is just a new combination of existing options. That's what you're always doing. And so The Art of Choosing was really a book that described for people what dilemmas we have as modern day choosers when we go out into the world and have to make difficult choices. Essentially, what are the challenges we have when we engage in the picking and finding exercise, which is clearly a very big part of what it means to choose. But Think Bigger goes to the next step and it says, what if the choice isn't out there? What if it's not there? Which often, if you think about the everyday decisions in our life, the most readily available solution is not that readily available to whatever problem we're confronting. And so how do you create those meaningful solutions? So Think Bigger is really about how you use your minds to create new choices.
I love the various stories that you told throughout the book about the different combinations that innovators, from artists to NASA scientists, engineers, use to create these to solve problems, and that seemed to be the core of innovation is coming up with new combinations to solve problems that would be useful to people. Indra Nooyi, former CEO and chair of PepsiCo, said that Think Bigger it was simply brilliant, at last a method to take us to the frontier of new ideas and beyond. So my question to you is, can you tell us about the Think Bigger method? How does this work?
So, in the book, what I do is I give people a 6-step method by which they can take any challenge that they have. And it could be a challenge as big as what should be my new career move, or it could be a challenge of like how do I take care of this problem that I'm having at work? Um, and it essentially gives you a 6-step method that you can use to solve any problem and come up with a solution. And while on the face of it,
Okay.
6 steps might sound like a lot, it's just like learning a new gym routine. Once you learn it, you get better and better and better with practice.
And as far as the application of it, how do you see that working in our daily lives? For example, you mentioned choosing our careers. How do we apply it
hmm
to which job do I take? Which path do I go down for my career?
So, what it does is it gives you essentially a structured way of going about answering that question. So, you know, traditionally, when we have that problem, like what should I do with my next job, what do we tend to do? We will go to a retreat or take a lot of long walks, or maybe go climb a mountain and hope that somehow with a lot of reflection it'll come to us. Or we'll ask people that know us, or we'll have a quick brainstorm with people. um, all of those assume that coming up with new ideas happens organically and that you don't really have a whole lot of control over it. But what Think Bigger shows you is that, in fact, you can control the ideation process. And it doesn't have to be beyond your reach, and you don't have to wait for it to arrive as if it was magic. And so the tool that is part of the Think Bigger method is something I call the choice map.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say I'm trying to figure out what should be my career, and I'm an undergrad in college, and I'm saying, so how do I figure out what's my career? That would be the problem I'm trying to solve. And notice how I phrased it as a question, because in Think Bigger, you always phrase things as a question, so that maintains an open mind. And then you identify what are your biggest questions underlying that you need to answer. Like, why is it hard for you to figure out? How should I figure out what's going to be my career preferences? And it could be, one subproblem might be, how do I figure out what I'm good at? How do I figure out what I like? Say that would be the second one. How do I figure out what potential options exist that go beyond what career services has on offer? Say, for example, those are 3 parts to the answer to my larger question. And so you break it down, and then what you do is you start to ask yourself, well, how has this problem been solved? For each of those subproblems, how has this problem been solved in my industry? Meaning, how have other people gone about figuring out, what are they good at? How have
Mm-hmm.
other people figured out what their interests are, and who's done that well? So what are the best practices?
Okay.
But then I look at how have people done this kind of thing in all different other arenas? Because it's not just college people that have this problem. Lots of people have this kind of problem, and how do they solve it? And so I ask people to go and search far and wide for solutions that are often in totally other industries, so that they can find a toolkit of different choices or options that they can then use. Once you've collected up different options, you can now ask yourself, well, given all this, what can I combine? Excuse me, I was about to sneeze. Given all this,
Right.
how can I imagine combining these options to create an interesting new path for myself?
Mm-hmm. How do we avoid identifying the wrong problem?
Well, that's a biggie.
Mm-hmm.
I think that most people end up solving the wrong problem. And in fact, if you look at many companies, about 72% of their strategic um, their strategic vision teams tend to fail because they have solved for the wrong problem. They've come up with a solution that doesn't solve for the problem that's, the one that really they should have solved for, and they only discover it later on once they've come up with a solution and then they discover nobody wants to implement it. There's different tactics. Well, first off, it's very, very important to not assume that the problem you want to solve is self-evident. It never is. No two people see that problem in the same way, even if they supposedly have the same experience. So you really need to have that discussion where you're getting from people to talk about, well, what are the reasons why we haven't reached our numbers this year? What are the reasons why we're not being able to hire all the people that we want to hire, for example? What are the reasons why the different parts of my company don't talk to each other? What are the reasons why it's difficult to create really good digital communication systems across the various parts of my institution, to just name a few problems? Different people will have very different understandings of what are the causes of that problem. And the first and foremost thing to do, as painful as it might seem, as tedious and feels unproductive, to just surface all the reasons. And yet it's only when you surface all the reasons and only then that you're really able to see, okay, what are the big buckets? What are the big categories? And now you can say, okay, fundamentally, we have, let's say, these, in my experience, it's usually somewhere between 3 to 6 big challenges that they have. A lot of stuff is noise or littler stuff. Usually it boils down to somewhere between 3 to 6 different buckets. And that's actually the process you want to go through to figure out what those are. Sometimes you're in an organization where there really isn't a lot of communication and there's a lot of hesitance around communicating. And for that, I have designed, and this isn't in the book, this is actually something I do both in my class as well as for different corporate retreats, is I do something that I call the innovation marketplace.
Okay.
And it's actually very simple, and yet it's very powerful. And so what you do as a, say a senior executive is you have everybody on a piece of paper, and you can do this with a group of somewhere between like 50 and 100 people. And what you do is you have them write down one, like you can ask them, say, look, if I wanted to make a really big difference, you pick, say as a senior person, you pick the problem you want to solve. I want to really increase growth by some percentage, or really want to create better communications, whatever it might be. Can you write down on a piece of paper one problem, which if it was solved, you think would make a really big difference? And, you could do one solution, but the problem with solutions is then people might rally around a solution that might be premature. And so I usually prefer if people do a problem. And so what you then do, and you actually can make this a lot of fun. So you now then give everybody in their room checks, like fake checks. I don't know, like $500,000, $1 million, and $5 million.
Okay.
Fake
Monopoly
checks.
money checks.
Yeah, monopoly money checks. You do whatever denomination you want, but you see, you have to have a hierarchy.
Okay.
And now each person has to go around the room, and I would not have them announce it out loud to the whole group in one shot. Do not be efficient about it. It has to be a networking exercise. So Whitney comes to Sheena and says, here's the problem I'm thinking. And Sheena tells Whitney, and then I go to Sarah, and Whitney goes to John, and John goes to Sarah. So every single person goes to every other person. And you go in pairs. And in each pair, the person describes what they think is the problem. And they don't stand around and discuss or like say, oh, you're wrong. That's not the point of the exercise. You're just learning from each other.
Okay.
And then at the end, each person invests their 3 checks in whichever 3 problems they would invest in, they would like to work on. and it can't be their own.
Okay.
And what that does is now the senior executive sees where there's the most energy. You see where's the most energy.
Yep.
You see what are the, say, in a group of 100, you're going to have roughly, I don't know, between 10 to 15 that will get the most investment.
Okay.
And now you can start to bucket those and see, okay, what are people seeing and where's the energy for creating change? It's a fun way to get people communicating and learning.
Yeah. So how, we in organizations, we come up with these, we have a problem, and then we sit around a table and we say, let's brainstorm about how
Yeah.
to solve this problem. In your book, you talk about kind of the pitfalls of brainstorm, the limitations of it. So how do we, instead of brainstorming, what should we be doing? Is it this process that you just described? Is that the alternative?
Yeah, so choice mapping is the alternative to brainstorming. The problem with brainstorming is it's exactly what you described. I say the problem and everyone just starts throwing out ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And they start throwing out ideas prematurely. They're also confounding the idea with, you could just throw out anything, and you're confounding the idea with what actually exists in the world, so you don't make a differentiation between those two. And so as a result, you don't know what's actually new, meaning untried, versus what's already been done. So that's another problem that happens, which you don't want, because remember, when you have a new solution, you want to try to increase the odds that it might work.
Right.
And so that the more you're able to build on stuff that's already happened in the past, the more likely you are to have evidence as to what does work and what doesn't work. Another thing that happens in brainstorming is it's not really a great way to surface diversity of thought, because whoever talks first, essentially that sets the tone, because everybody's going to build on that person, and they're anchored on that idea, and so everybody's mind goes in a particular direction.
Mm-hmm.
In general, even if you don't want to do choice mapping, doing the simple thing of having people first think by themselves about
Mm-hmm.
what's causing the problem and what might be some solutions that work. If you just do that simple act and have each person think about it by themselves and then share rather than brainstorm, share their thoughts, that in itself will increase the quantity of ideas by about 3 times, as well as the diversity.
Such a small thing to change about how we form new ideas. Think about it solo and then share those ideas with the group. And
it's also a great way to we talk about how to leverage diversity. Diversity
mm-hmm.
increases quality, but you're not going to actually get any benefits of diversity if you do a traditional brainstorming, because a lot of people don't. They either say yes or they don't talk, because no one wants to say the odd thing.
Right, right. So the book, you gave us so many examples of innovators. Do you have a favorite innovation story that you researched and were able to fit into the book?
Oh gosh, I like a lot of favorite innovation story. Well, I love Lady Liberty, right? Because she's just inspiring for me. Maybe it's just my immigrant heart, but I always loved Lady Liberty. So I guess that is one of my most favorites. It's hard to compete with Lady Liberty.
Yeah.
At once she's just a statue, and unto herself she stands for really nothing. And yet, what's powerful about her is that she is just a combination of things that, Bartholdi had available to him in his time.
Mm-hmm.
And he combined interesting pieces together, like, the face of his mother
Right.
Plus, he got the pose from a very famous painting at the time, Lady of Truth, La Verite. Um,
The coin.
the coin, which was so the crown that was on the 5 franc coin, and then he just copied the sort of size and general aura of it from the great sculptures that were guarding the Egyptian tombs. So once you say, look, he just slapped together things that were familiar to him and he made a sculpture. And yet, she's so much more than that. She's such an example of what is a big idea. And what's a big idea is that she comes to mean something that goes beyond what the innovator perhaps even imagined. But because he built her in a way that inspired people, Emma Lazarus comes along. She writes a poem that becomes famous, the great Colossus, and she writes of freedom as seen through the eyes of an immigrant, and then but even she doesn't make it a big idea. Then comes along the great the great niece of Alexander Hamilton, who finds the poem in some bookstore collecting dust. And then she's like, oh, this should be on the pedestal. And then, little by little, it's the ships that come through the harbor of New York. It's the movie. It's like she's come to mean something to each and every single individual that beholds her.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So, according to your research, when creating a suite of products or services to offer in the market, what's the optimal number of options to offer a customer to maximize their likelihood of hitting that purchase button, so to speak? Like, is there such thing as too many choices?
Yeah, I mean, I've studied that for a very long time. We know that too many choices is overwhelming for people, and then they, either give up or choose the default in some way or choose suboptimally. In general, what we know is that it's optimal for people to be aware of somewhere between 7 plus or 2 choices. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean that as a retailer you only offer between 5 and 9 options, because you can handle a lot more categories. And so let's say I'm a retailer, I can give you different categories, say of ice cream or shoes or clothing, etc. It's just that, again, per category, you want to make it roughly somewhere between 5 and 7. Just because cognitively, that's when we are most able to not just keep track, but also differentiate. Mm-hmm. Now, it is really important as a retailer to not only limit the number of choices per category, but really make sure that the differences are clear. When people can't tell them apart, that's when they essentially get nervous about making a choice.
I love online shopping, but some retailers just have so many options that I just have to shut down shut down the site, because there's way too many options to be sifting through and poking around through. So I totally relate to that.
So what has to happen that's a great example, right? If you know exactly what you're looking for, then great. You just go there and you just search. Where it becomes a problem is when you don't know what you're looking for, in which case the display, the way they're categorized and organized, is what really makes a difference in terms of your experience. In fact, when I teach people how to innovate in the Think Bigger process, I keep in mind our cognitive limitations, so that notice how when I was talking about breaking down a problem, I very much stuck to essentially in that 7 plus or minus 2. Even when I have people go into different industries to identify different potential solutions to different problems that they have, I again stick within that range, 7 plus or minus 2. Now, on the upfront, that might sound like I'm constraining you, but I'm actually giving you more choice. I'm actually empowering you by putting those constraints up front. I'm actually enabling you to create many, many, many more solutions than you would through any other method.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something like over 3,000 options could be created from using your method of,
Yeah, a typical choice map,
right.
which is a 5 by 5, you can generate at least 3,125 unique solutions.
That's amazing. And the fact that your framework will then help you narrow down which of those solutions would be best to solve that problem. That's going to be revolutionary for how we think about creating new ideas.
It's helpful for how you create new ideas. It's helpful for figuring out how to reduce your choice set so that you can better see which is the more dominating alternative. It's helpful as a way to evaluate new choices.
Wonderful.
So
One of
think
my
of it as a problem-solving tool.
problem solving tool. So one of my last questions for you, given all the work that you've done, all the research that you've done, as a professor, what's a question that people never ask you about your work that you wish they would ask you?
But they never asked me that I wish they would ask me. I suppose it's what was my favorite choice that I created.
Okay.
That might be one question that I'm trying to remember if anyone's ever asked me that.
Well, I'll ask you, what was your favorite choice that you've created?
My favorite choice was my choice to study choice. But I'll let you pick any other question you want to ask me. I'm usually very open.
That's good. That's good. I mean, it's fascinating the choices that we make based on our experiences, and I'm sure your upbringing led you to create and make the choices that you've made in life, and led you to write these very fascinating, helpful books. So it sounds like you're making all the right choices, or at least most of them.
My best choice was the choice to study choice. I've certainly made mistakes in some of the choices I've made in life, but I would say that one choice was the best, and I'm very happy that I made it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we're going to wrap up our time here, but before we do, we like to do a little lightning round. And I'm just going to ask you 3 questions. Give us the first thing that comes to mind, rapid fire as we can. Okay, so first question is, who's been the most influential person in your life?
My advisor, Mark Lepper. He was very influential in forming my thinking. I'd say Mark Lepper. I owe him a lot.
Okay. And secondly, what's the best piece of advice someone ever gave you? So maybe Mark or someone else. What's the best piece of advice you've been given?
It was one of my very first employees. And she said, I know you're really, really smart and you'll be surrounded by a lot of smart people, but what's really important is to make sure you find people that are nice.
Has that been easy or difficult, you think, finding people that are nice?
I think sometimes it's not always easy to know who's truly nice, and I have come to realize that there was a lot of wisdom in that saying.
Agreed. And lastly, what life advice would you give to young people today? You have the pleasure of cultivating the minds of tomorrow. What advice do you give to them?
My My biggest takeaway is that, there's a lot of stuff coming at you every single day. A lot of information, a lot of choices, a lot of opportunities. Every morning, you should wake up and ask yourself, what's the one thing that's really important to do today? And so it's be choosy about choosing. Don't make every choice. It's not worth it.
Be choosy about choosing. I love it. Love it. Thank you, Sheena, so much for joining us and helping us think bigger. This has been a pleasure chatting with you today.
Thank you.